Hello again, everyone. So as we wrap up our views on psychological approaches, I wanted to bring us back to this quote of how it seems like so many different things, but really we just need to find those core principles. And those core principles are what we've been exploring through this video series of the 7 different approaches that we've discussed so far. Now, I bring this up now because our 8th approach is really starting to just interact with the different approaches and the different strengths and weaknesses that they have. So, what we should know about modern psychology is it's a bit more eclectic. Most psychologists are going to pick and choose the pieces of the different approaches that will best explain what's going on within their particular research or with their particular clients. So it's now okay for psychologists to say they practice cognitive behavioral therapy. As you take the pieces of cognitive, you take the pieces of behaviorism, and you've now created tools using those 2 examples. And I just picked those 2 as a common therapeutic technique, but there are so many different examples of where the approaches mix and match. And when it comes down to it, we're all talking about behaviors and mental processes. So as we're trying to explain those, every single approach has its own answers, and sometimes they complement each other, which makes it even more important to not be so exclusive. While there has been a period in psychology's history where you had to essentially line up with one approach and stick always on that approach, that's long gone now. And so now psychologists are using whatever tools necessary from any approach to make sure that they are best serving their clients and their research. And so as we start to really look more critically, we start to see that these different approaches can complement each other, but yet there's pieces that seem to be missing from each individual approach as well. And so while certain specialty approaches might offer a better insight into something going on, it's usually not everything we need to be able to solve it, which is where the most modern style of approach that we can go into is the last one of the biopsychosocial approach. And this image is taken directly from the Myers textbook, so it should look familiar to us already. But I feel like this is the best way to explain how this comes into it. Instead of trying to just isolate the behavior or mental process and a specific factor, the biopsychosocial approach is willing to acknowledge and embrace the fact that it's not just one thing. And so when we are working on a viewpoint from the biopsychosocial approach, this is where we actually take a look and we say, okay, so there are biological influences on this behavior. And those could be elements of the biological approach, such as the genetic influences, any sorts of individual chemical profiles that you have. That can be hormones you're taking, that could be external chemical influences on you as well. Those are all counted as biological. We also know that there's psychological influences. So I would like to just clarify with you that psycho is referring to psychological. It is not referring to psychodynamic. And once again, it is not referring to psychodynamic. Psychodynamic and humanistic are both on the declining side of these approaches. So psychological, as you start to look at these examples, are much more focused on behaviorism and the cognitive approaches. And so on this purple box of psychological influences, learned fears, learned expectations, very often as a trigger to behaviorism. So what has your environment conditioned you to be afraid of or to expect? But again, we're using those words expectations, which means we're also bringing in cognition into that also. Your emotions, your cognitive processing, and the way that you're thinking about these. And so just contributing to these 2, we can now say, oh, well, I have a certain genetic predisposition to think about things more negatively. And so as you're analyzing my thoughts, well, yeah, I have a genetic trend to think about this way, but then that's also explaining how I'm thinking the way that I'm thinking. And then we bring in the social cultural influences, because no one is immune from the social cultural influence that they have in life. So that could be people pressuring you. That can be those unspoken norms and expectations that we talked about in our previous videos. That can be direct social pressure or indirect social pressure, or just what you think is expected of you. So when we combine all of them together, it's a much more comprehensive way to understand behaviors and mental processes, because we're acknowledging that you have certain biological tendencies. We're acknowledging that you have a history as well as thoughts, but that you're not separated from the culture in which you're interacting also. And so if we work on explaining behaviors and mental processes with a biopsychosocial approach, it is important to make sure that you're considering all three of these different components as we're working through that. So from there, let's go back to our bear, or our man wrestling the bear. So according to the biopsychosocial approach, why is he wrestling the grizzly bear? Once again, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and come up with your own answer before resuming so we can compare notes. So the first thing you need to check about your answer is there a biological component to it? If there's not, go back and revisit and come back and pick up at that point. The next thing you should look at, is there a psychological component to your answer? That may not say psychological, but it may express itself in a way like his thinking processes, his decision-making skills, his previous experiences influencing his current choices. And is there a sociocultural influence within that? So one of the answers that could include all of them, maybe this man has grown up in a village where animal wrestling is a common pastime of entertainment. So in doing this, as he's growing up, he's having to try to figure out how he's going to fit in with this culture. And as he matures and starts to get more testosterone in his body, he's now stronger, he's feeling more aggressive, and feels like he's now ready to be able to go through a rite of passage in his community to be able to wrestle a bear and join his life in the next steps. So through that, I mentioned testosterone and his physical maturity in that case. I mentioned his thought processes and decisions, as well as the odd social influence of that particular community. We could go differently. We could just say, well, he was, what was he? We'll go with he had high testosterone levels, making him feel aggressive. He knew he couldn't take those out on any of the people in his life, but he had a friend who said, hey, there's a bear wrestling competition next weekend. And so therefore, all those elements came together into that choice in this way also. There's a lot of different ways this answer can go. So as always, feel free to check in with me if you are unsure about the answer that you came up with. I did want to close out once again with this quote, just to remind you again, as we continue to proceed through this school year, you will find that our units are largely hanging all of their terms on one or more of these core approaches. So take the time. If you need to watch the videos again, feel free to do so. But this is critical foundational work. If you can really understand these approaches, everything else will link back to this core understanding from our first unit and make the whole course significantly easier for you, especially when it comes down to breaking down certain like multiple choice errors and distractor questions that become very obvious when you understand what approach that question is coming from, and so therefore other approaches just can't even fit into the answer. So as always, if there are any questions or concerns, or if I need to clarify anything else throughout this unit on psychology's approaches, please reach out to me. I want to make sure you are as successful as you can as we lay these foundations that are going to be so critical for the rest of our course.